I'm so excited to be talking to Kelly Sheppard Murray today. She is a featured artist at Charlotte Russell Contemporary, a contemporary art gallery in Cameron Village, now known as the Village District in Raleigh, North Carolina. Kelly currently has an installation on view, a solo show called Curiosities, and is on view until March 26th, 2021. Kelly, it's so good to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about how you became an artist and your background and how you came to where you are now.
Yes, so I left high school knowing I was going to become an artist, but had not taken art since seventh grade. So where and how I had that idea, I'm not really sure. I had taken a lot of photographs. I'd had a camera in my hands since I was quite young. I would get my father's hand-me-down cameras, but I did not have any true artistic skill at that point. But somehow I had a conviction that that's what I was going to do. And so I went to school, just kind of ready to just soak it in and learn whatever I could, which I think probably helped me become a good student, because I was just like, there's something to learn, then I want to learn it. And initially I was intending on becoming a painter. And that's sort of the direction that I was starting in, with a love of color and that sort of thing. I'd worked a little bit in a kind of artistic environment in a frame shop, and I learned my art history by looking at master prints, everything from Kandinsky to Monet to Manet to Picasso, in this frame shop and print shop. But so I got a little bit of education there, but I just went to college knowing I wanted to become an artist. But it was when I transferred to UNCG after being at then Peace College, I took my first three-dimensional class, and kind of my first project was not great, but I fell in love and just sort of got this bug of like, oh, this is something that's a thing. And I had no experience with sculpture. And so that's how I kind of, that became my focus both for my undergraduate and graduate degree. And it just sort of went from there. So that's kind of how I became an artist. And so I've worked in the arts my whole career. I've taught high school because my undergraduate degree did include a degree in education. But after a few years of teaching high school and looking like I was a 16-year-old, I ran away from that life and went to graduate school at East Carolina University. And it was a really good fit for me. I got to travel abroad 3 different times to Eastern Europe and throughout Europe, which really expanded my experience and my familiarity with the arts. So, yeah.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about your sculpture practice? Currently on view are what you call curiosities. Can you describe what the curiosities are?
Yeah, so after about a 10-year hiatus from making sculpture and mostly doing painting and drawing and working 2-dimensionally due to kind of space limitations and some back issues and things like that, I had spent that period of time really painting and drawing. And in 2016, sort of towards the end of 2016, I felt really compelled to begin finding a way to make sculpture again. And so I decided, well, I don't have the conventional sort of resources and space to create either welding or cast metal or even carved stone and things like that. So I was like, what can I work with? And I was like, well, if I can't work large, then let me work in quantity. And also I thought the idea of kind of working in repetition. So I would also build a vocabulary or sort of rebuild a visual vocabulary for sculpture. And so I decided to start doing a sculpture a day for a year at the end of 2016. It was like in middle of December, like, don't wait for January 1, like, let's start in the middle of December. And so I started doing that every day for the next year. And that was really transformative in a number of ways for me. It got me out of my head and got me really thinking in a very tactile and specific way. But through the process of creating something new every day, I was I was really learning the vocabulary of making form and not overthinking it. And that had been a sort of obstacle for me, is trying to um, have the mindset of graduate school where you really have to think about why and who and what for, and that had kind of ground me to a halt in a way. And so I was like, okay, let me like find a way to kind of work through that and find a method that worked for me. And so doing this every day was something that fit into my lifestyle. At that point, I had a young child, and I teach full-time at the local community college, and it was a way for me to integrate it into my life. And the intention was all along to do a piece every day and then figure out ways to arrange them together on the wall. And it kind of took on a life a little different than I thought, but that was sort of the fun of it. And, initially I started using things that I just had around the studio, wire and little odd bits of wood and odd bits of, wire mesh and things like that. And wanting to transform them a little bit, and having experience with encaustic, which is a wax painting technique, I began to coat them with the encaustic, and that transformed these kind of industrial materials into something much more beautiful and kind of peculiar and unfamiliar, but yet they seemed like you couldn't quite figure out, were they natural or were they industrial? And that sort of kind of in between space was kind of interesting to me, because my work had this thread of sort of environmental kind of ideas for a long time. My drawings at that point had been about native species of plants, but I was really wanting to kind of shift gears a bit. And so my years of taking close-up photographs of like fungus and lichen and all these kinds of things started to perk to the top, but I wasn't necessarily trying to replicate them or make it look like them, but work in a way that more kind of mirrored a process of nature where things got built up on the surface over time, and it sort of transformed or covered or, in hid, whatever was underneath. And that to me was sort of an intuitive aspect of what played out in the work. And then seeing them kind of cluster together, reminded me of just the way things kind of encrust trees and cover, rock and fallen logs and things like that. And as part of kind of the cycle of life. And so I don't know, it's a very meandering logic, but there is kind of a logic that sort of just led me down this trajectory. But I think the openness of not knowing exactly where the project would go, but just kind of like having this general goal kind of to kind of pull me along was, really very transformative for my practice and for my art, and in a lot of ways.
So I love that your pieces each have a little inventory label, which obviously helps you sort and catalog all of your pieces, but it also has this interesting nod to the Natural History Museum and how you see your curiosities, as you call them, or sculptures, as little scientific specimens, almost as if you're putting a fungus specimen on a wall with the label.
Yeah. And I actually built exhibits for this Natural Science Museum and for other design companies in the early 2000s. And so I think that all kind of played into my kind of awareness, this idea of like how we present information to the public or convey it or organize it and arrange it scientifically. And so when I was doing these pieces and they were starting to pile up, the initial handful didn't have those. And I was like, I needed a logical way. And I'm sure I did the same thing that like scientists a couple hundred years ago is like, I got to come up with a way to organize these and distinguish them, because otherwise, what am I going to do? And so I was like, okay, well, I like the idea. They do feel like these odd objects that you could have discovered or found or whatever. And the idea of the cataloging and numbering them. So I initially looked at, should I order, something from a scientific supply company? But then I had the copper, and, it had this nice sort of quality to it. And it was really easy just to do the stamping. And so I can, each piece kind of comes up with the Curiosities sort of continue to get numbered. And then other pieces that are made discreetly in and of themselves get a unique numbering system. And so, yeah, so that idea of like how specimen, either that are being cataloged for a collection or for scientific study out in the wild, are kind of numbered, definitely was a thread that kind of came in from my natural history exhibit building to this practice. Yeah.
Well, the way that you install the works is extremely interesting. I am seated right now in front of a definite focal point of the exhibition. It's a piece called Where Trouble Melts Like Lemon Drops, created in 2020. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so that was the second piece I did during the pandemic that was a series of multiples. And I initially started that with just a few random pieces similar to one I had done earlier in the pandemic that just had a little bit different look. But this one I started, and they were originally arranged on the wall in sort of a chaotic manner. And I realized I wanted to kind of have an equal number. And so on the wall, which already had 100 holes in it for the pieces to go in, I arranged them and realized that I just kind of kept arranging them, and I realized that they felt better when they were kind of grouped in like items. And I think it's our human compulsion to kind of organize things. And it may be the moment where we need order because everything seems so lacking of order in a lot of ways. And so it became like this graph thing for me. And I was like, oh, okay, I need 5 more yellows and I need 3 more pinks. And I was able to kind of then determine what was needed. But I also really love this sort of transition of color. And I think the sort of rainbow arrangement, which is certainly where the title comes from, just has this positive kind of quality. And I wanted to kind of maintain that, so that the title is really meant to be kind of optimistic. So it's kind of related to this idea. I didn't want to use rainbow in the title because it seemed too obvious. I like something that has a little kind of leaves you kind of wondering. And so I thought of the song Over the Rainbow. And so that's a line from the song. And that specific line to me is like, where kind of, it's just where things become better, and like the trouble's melting away. And so I felt like that the moment we were in, that positive, hopeful look, it's, outlook really needed to be part of the piece since it was created during the pandemic. And so that's where that title came from.
Well, great. I love this work, and I love this little color shifts that happen between each of the different colors. It's one of those pieces that every time you look at it, you see something new about it you didn't discover. What's interesting about Kelly's work too is that it's the way that they're installed as well, is that the shadows around them become part of the piece. So she installs the pieces, and they can come in sets of 5, 10, 30. There's different arrangements and configurations that happen, but part of it is thinking about the negative space around it as well. So I just love that. So some other works on view are, there's a piece called Since Antiquity. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece? Currently, it's a set of 10 that we have on view, and the colors shift from sort of like a darky purpley, navy bluish, blackish kind of configuration.
Yeah, so another kind of sub theme or kind of idea that comes into my work sometimes, and I think particularly with that one, is an idea about sort of cycles of life. And sometimes people see dark colors as kind of negative and looming, and to me, I see them as sort of like compost, or like the deep part of the woods where everything is sort of breaking down and changing. So I kept thinking of the idea of carbon, this element of carbon, and because you think of that as being black and really dark, but I don't think of it negatively. And but it just sort of has this richness. And so when I was just sort of reading and brainstorming, and I was reading online somewhere about carbon, this line stood out to me that said, carbon's been noted and discussed since antiquity. And so this idea that there was I love the sort of poetry of that because it sort of alludes to the sort of timelessness. And then the works also, because they, they sort of hint at this idea of like, is it this thing that's been buried and has been unearthed, or somebody's discovered it, or is it, whatever it is. And so this idea of it being something that is sort of stumbled upon and found, but maybe it's been here for a long time. I mean, that sort of ambiguity of that. And so there was something about that sense antiquity seemed kind of appealing as just a little, kind of gave you a little something to latch onto. And I like that. I like to have a title that leaves the viewer kind of thinking. It gives them something to kind of latch onto and to begin to generate their own story with what that means, rather than, I mean, my instinct is just to number things because it's just sort of, but I feel like that leaves a little bit unsaid as to what the thought process is. And so I want to hint at something that gives a viewer a little bit of something to kind of land on and then kind of swirl around in their own brain about with the work.
Well, great. Another work in the show is called After the Flourish. It's a set of pink curiosities by Pink Curiosities. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, and that one sort of, in a way, is a kind of companion piece to the black and kind of purplish black piece. And the After the Flourish is because I thought of those as like fading flowers. But to me, that has a connotation that felt a little bit negative, and like this sort of longing of something that is lost. And to me, the After the Flourish hinted at the cycle of life kind of moment. And so it says that there was this like vibrant, rich, growing thing. But this is just the moment after that. And somehow that in my mind seemed a little more positive, and it hinted that the flourish would come again. And to me, I think that positive aspect really appeals to me. And I try to have that in the work consistently.
Yeah, the After the Flourish piece is a set of 5 pink curiosities, and it is a very subtle pink. So I can see what you mean, where it's that moment right after a flower has bloomed and it's starting to fade, and it doesn't have any less of the beauty, but the color is starting to be a little less saturated in a way. And it's beautiful to think about capturing that little moment.
Yeah.
Great. Another work on view is called Just a Hint, and it is a series of 3 curiosities together that are white with sort of bands of yellow throughout, and they're meant to be the 3 together, and they work seamlessly together. So let's talk a little bit about that piece.
Yeah, and that one was from, I think, fairly early in the curiosities, or maybe midpoint. And at that point, I wasn't necessarily seeing them or making them intentionally to go with one another. I was beginning to think about that, but most of the time at that point in making them, I was just kind of making them isolated. But somehow at that stage, I was like, let me see what this looks like and make these 3 that go together and like work on a similar kind of color scheme. So the idea of that title is fairly recent in relation to the show, because I don't know if I've shown them together in that way previously, but once I kind of put them together, and especially on that blue wall, they looked really nice. But that Just a Hint, it's sort of like, I think what the yellow makes me think of is just the way pollen dusts the petals of a flower. And so there's something about that little hint of that yellow on there that sort of makes me think of that. And so I felt like it was a way to kind of round out the relationship of the other pieces in the show.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that dusting of pollen. That was the first time hearing the pollen component, and I 100% see it looking at the piece.
Yeah.
And
well,
then,
good.
and then the final work currently on view is White with Spots.
Yeah, so that title probably has less poetry to it. But I sometimes, and I think it's sort of like the counterpoint to the piece behind you. And I frequently have these pieces that I sort of jokingly call them the Funfetti Pieces.
Yes.
They feel a little bit like kind of candy or something, but they sort of have a playfulness to them. But then I also think sometimes about seashells, and there's some seashells that are like candy stripe. They're like called candy striped or something like that. And so that idea of like, you know, whether it's a shell or whether it's some other natural object, sometimes they're named after like kind of benign human, like ordinary human things. And then other times they do have more poetry or like space related. So that one doesn't have as in-depth, but I do like the sort of playful color that play on those speckled ones. And yeah, so I kind of, that theme, that kind of idea comes up a lot in my work. Just because I think it, you know, and I've had people say, I just want to eat. It feels like candy. I just want to eat it.
Yes. So White with Spots is a sort of like an ovally circle shaped work. It's a standalone one, and the backdrop is white, and then it has these beautiful yellow, pink, red, green speckles on it, and it completely looks like funfetti. So I really see the reference to the candy, but then it also, the spots are really a tie-in with the different hues that you're able to come. So Kelly's works are made from aluminum that she hand paints with a caustic, and she tints the caustic in all these various beautiful hues. It's really your specialty. And White with Spots really showcases some of the different colors that you have, and it's sort of a less obvious way than a work like Where Trouble Melts, like Lemon Drops, where you can really see the color shifts happen. You can also see the color shifts happen too with White with Spots.
Yeah.
And thinking about color shifts and gradations, I know currently you're working on a project, a 100-day project where you're going to create a curiosity every single day, and it's featured behind you in the video now. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your piece, what you're working on?
Yeah, so this is my most planned one. The one behind you started sort of, you know, I was like, okay, I'm going to create 100 of these smaller little pieces. And this one, I've already mapped out each of the pigments that I'm going to use as sort of the starting point. And there's 10 separate colors. So each row will be a separate color. And then it's really working on a color gradient. And I like this idea of, it's a little bit of a color theory kind of thing, and a study in the way color plays on form. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of like one of the formal things that I get interested in, because I notice that depending on the pigment, depending on the complexity of the form, the light bounces off the surface really differently. Like the dark ones, the light plays on it really differently. The highlights actually show more than you would think because that's dark surface. And so by playing with the gradients, it sort of, it creates this sort of visual movement. And it also is I'm kind of working through this in a more methodical way than I usually do, because I work in, you know, I have this very stereotypical sort of frenetic way, but consistent in a certain way. But and so this one's much more methodical. I have this list of my pigments, and I don't use a specific ratio. It's very visually done, but I really love the idea of doing a daily project because it gives me something that sort of grounds the rest of my practice. It keeps me kind of ticking away. I like having my hands busy while I'm thinking of other ideas and projects and things. So frequently I'll have a few things going at one time, or I'll have notebooks out and one project leads to the other. But if I have one that sort of becomes the backbone of what I'm doing, it's not the entirety of my project, of my sort of practice at a given moment, but it sort of is the through line that when I go into the studio, I have a starting point to work from. And it allows me just to start working and to not have to, wait for inspiration or flow or something to happen as if it sort of magically occurs, but it allows me just to get to work. And that to me has been one of the things that I realized was helpful about doing the daily project is like having my head into the game every day prevented some of the some of the obstacles that I'd previously kind of experienced in terms of perfectionism and things like that, that I think a lot of artists and a lot of people sort of have. And so a daily project really grounds my practice for me. And so I kind of continually, every year, I will do a 100-day project once or twice often.
Mhm.
So,
What's really fun about your 100-day projects when you do them is that you can follow along on your Instagram at Kelly Sheppard Murray.
underscore art.
Underscore art at Kelly
Yeah.
Sheppard Murray underscore art. And Kelly, you're so great about posting the progress of them. And every day you post them individually, but then also they're building up. And so it's definitely worth a follow to make sure that you see the progress. And it's very cool seeing a work being made in person, via social media, I guess, not as
Yeah.
seeing sort of like real time every day, seeing it build up. I'm really excited to see what it looks like at the end of 100 days.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I like that idea of like sharing and connecting with people on Instagram, and I personally like the accountability of it, and it's become such a way to maintain connection with people when we're living fairly remotely, and just kind of saying, we're out here working, and people make comments, and I really like to respond back and forth with them on Instagram. So, and that was what held me accountable when I did my 365, is it felt like, at that point I didn't have that many people that I was connected with, but it was such a way to kind of hold myself accountable to keep going. And there's something really valuable about that. Whether anybody really notices is a separate thing, but it sort of holds yourself accountable, which is great.
Well, I love having your work on view at the gallery. As I said, Curiosities is on view until March 26, 2021. Make sure to check out Kelly on Instagram at Kelly Sheppard Murray _art. And last thing, so Kelly, how do you work with commissions? Are there different configurations that can happen based on people's spaces or?
Yeah, absolutely. I love doing commissions. Having worked in design industry and worked with clients, I feel really comfortable with that. And in addition, people, because my work is out on Instagram and pretty easy to find, people are familiar with my work and kind of have a variety of examples on my website that have been placed in different environments. And I really love that idea of seeing kind of the space that somebody's thinking of, if that's relevant to that situation. And there's such a flexibility with the way these pieces can be, because they can exist in small groups of 5 or 10, or they can be larger groups, and the scale can change somewhat as well. And so it's really easy to kind of cater that to an individual space or different budget kind of concerns and things like that. But I really love coming up with something that seems to be very suited for somebody's individual kind of space or their aesthetic and that sort of thing. Yeah, so that would be great. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's great to talk to you and see you.